If the memory of Jason still haunts you, you're not alone. Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning.
Severe trauma at age 12. Brutal self-defense, murder of a psychopathic killer. Boy, they've given him every therapy they can think of. It's wonder his mind isn't fried with all the drugs they've given him.
The mindless, murderous fury that was buried with Jason has been reborn.
Pete!
And suddenly, terror has become child's play. Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning.
Hello, everyone, and thank you once again for downloading the Pod and the Pendulum, your horror movie podcast that is uncovering every single horror movie franchise, one episode in one movie at a time. And we are back once again. We have passed the quarter point for our, actually the 1/3 point now for our Friday the 13th coverage. And we are joined once again by our co-host, Jerry Smith. Jerry, how are we doing tonight?
I am doing so good. I'm so excited to talk about this one. It's a lot of fun.
I can tell, man, you were going nuts today on Twitter with all the stuff for Part 5. It's so this is going to be an interesting show because I have not done my OCD thing where I write like 10 pages of notes beforehand, and we are flying by the seat of our boxers tonight.
I revisited it this morning, I revisited it this morning, and I was just like writing down just notes of like stuff that I wanted to think of, and like I think I wrote down at least like 12 pages.
I revisited it on Sunday morning after we had hosted 14 9-year-old girls for a sleepover. And I just needed to see kids butchered in horrific ways after all of them had left.
I bet.
Yeah, it was a night. It was 9-year-old girls are terrifying. I think I'll post the video of the piñata ceremony. We had a piñata and it didn't break, so I picked it up. I'm like, okay, I'm going to drop it. And when I drop it, you guys, it's going to be a free-for-all. And thinking, like, how bad could it be? They were injuries, man. These kids were going nuts on one another.
Bones popping out.
Oh, my God. We had to pull my daughter off another girl.
Oh, no. That's good.
It was a good time. So we are joined by a very special guest tonight, by screenwriter Michael Varrati. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. I have awful pronunciation. So, Michael, how are we doing tonight?
I'm very well. I'm very excited to be here with you both and talk about this movie. I'm a big enthusiast of the Friday franchise, but I have a special affinity for Part 5. And when I saw Jerry looking for people to talk about it, I think I very quickly was like, oh, hello, hi, me. And because I just love an underdog or a redheaded stepchild, and this movie is certainly that for the original run of the Paramount Friday movies. And I'm just excited that you are letting me talk about it with you.
So what is it about Part 5? Like, what is it about Friday the 13th first? And then, in particular, what is it about Part 5 that makes you want to draw it to your bosom and just cuddle it like a kitten?
Well, Friday the 13th in general just has that kind of 80s nostalgia power. I guess, though, nostalgia maybe isn't exactly the word. It is now, but for those of us who grew up during the time, it was just sort of it. It was the zeitgeist defining moment. Like, you could not think of horror of that era without thinking of movies like Friday or Nightmare on Elm Street, because they just so dominated the landscape. And even though in this like world of digital where entertainment is so available to us in any time of day on all these platforms, the way we engaged with it was different. And I remember this kind of era where like Jason Voorhees would be a guest on Arsenio Hall and how outrageous it was. And there's just something that like it goes beyond the movies, but the movies were sort of the core of what helped kind of define that moment in time. And I think of these movies as kind of setting the standard for a lot that came after. Obviously, when Kevin Williamson sits down to write Scream, there are a lot of tropes that he goes to the Friday movies for because, you know, anytime campers have sex, people die. That's literally the basis of this franchise. Two counselors have sex and aren't paying attention to Jason, and a murderous, you know, legacy follows. And The Final Girls, a more recent movie, is a love letter to these movies. It's such a bedrock for the horror community. And if you're a horror fan of a certain age, I don't know how it's not a bedrock for you. So that's why I like Friday the 13th. I'm just very fond of it. And as far as 5 goes, there are things about this. I've said this in different interviews before, as well as like on my own podcast frequently. I'm a big fan of anything that feels like it's forbidden. When I was a kid, I remember, even though it's not, you know, in any way, shape, or form quite as hard a movie as the one we're discussing today, I remember I watched this USA Up All Night airing of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, and that was like a epiphanal moment for me, because all of a sudden I'm seeing this movie that was not like the movies they were playing at the multiplex or the movies that they were advertising during prime time. And I became aware of this thing that like, oh, there's this whole other world of otherness. And horror by its like very definition is subversive. So when something actually exists within the horror genre, let alone a major franchise that we all love, that subverts the subversive, that's kind of delicious. Like, I get why this movie doesn't work for people, but I kind of love that it's a Friday the 13th movie in the middle of the franchise that dares to deviate away from Jason in a very peculiar and strange way. And it's sleazy. It was directed by a former porn filmmaker. Everything about it is a little less popcorn movie. You know, I do love that in part 6, which is I will leave to whoever is left to discuss that next. But 6 kind of goes back to the big budget blockbuster of it all, and I think that this movie is kind of his like dirty cousin, and I'm always fond of the dirty cousins.
Well, that ends. I've always thought part 5 just kind of felt like the 42nd Street Friday the 13th. You know,
For
like
sure.
it always felt to me like it was closer to Maniac than it would be like Halloween, and I think that's something that I like really latched onto. Because if there's any film in the entire series that feels like that forbidden fruit, it's A New Beginning. As a kid, like when I came across it, it was the only Friday the 13th that I wouldn't watch around my dad. Because I was just, I mean, if you saw what I was watching with that one, you know, I'd be sent to my room. It's such a sleazy quality about that. And I think that comes off in like a good way to people like me and like yourself.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, I think that it probably got unjustly maligned because it was a Friday the 13th movie. We know, living, especially now in the era of Twitter, how kind of obstinate fandom can be, right? And I think that sometimes rather than exploring new territory and taking stories to new places, people seem to just demand more of what they already know, which is sort of limiting in a storytelling way. So it was a bold move for them to make this movie the way they did, because we know from studio perspective and market research that like the fans want Jason Voorhees in a hockey mask at camp, lather, rinse, repeat. And I think that if this movie had not been a Friday the 13th movie, if it had been just an other like woods set slasher, maybe a Friday the 13th pastiche that wasn't billed a Friday the 13th movie, 80s fans might actually look upon it in a different way, but because it's sort of like they build it as this, and we know how fans can be, it is a little more dubious.
Well, I also it's a film that kind of like Halloween 4 and 5 to me. I love those movies with a passion, and I'm really fond of A New Beginning as well. I've never considered them good sequels to the source material, but like good films on their own. Like you said, if this was something else, if it was called something else, there would probably have been a better reception. And I think if you could kind of separate the part 5s of Friday the 13th, or, you know, I mean, I can't believe I'm defending it a little bit, but like the Jason Goes to Hell entries that are like way out there, if you could find, you know, if you could kind of watch them on their own, they're pretty entertaining. It's just, I think a lot of people, they hold up every sequel to what came before it, and when it does something different, you know, a lot of them don't even give it a chance.
It's true.
It's difficult to remove the film from the context of what comes before it. And this is also like Friday the 13th Part 5. It looks like the other 4 movies in terms of the way it's filmed. It looks like looks like Part 3 in particular, and we're going to get to the setting of it overall, but it has that like kind of like low grade filmy look to it overall. The characters are mostly recognizable in terms of who you would expect to see in a movie like this, with a little bit more, maybe a little bit more quirk than I think we've been used to be seeing. I think there are some very memorable characters to be found in this movie. So it's just recognizable enough for fans that I could understand where maybe it's a little bit off-putting, you know, when they come out of the theater thinking they were going to see something, and it looks like it's like, I use the burger analogy a lot because I really like food. But when mom or grandma would make you a hamburger and throw it in between like 2 sheets of like Wonder Bread and tell you it was as good as like a Wendy's burger or like an In-N-Out burger, and you're like, it's still good, but it's not what I was expecting overall. So it's just not what I was like looking for at that point. That's kind of how I look at it. Although over time you start to look back and you have that nostalgia for like grandma's cooking at that point, and you like it a lot more, you know, 30 years later than you did back then when you were a stubborn little prick and a kid. So,
well, there's always
true.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it's true too about exactly what you say about the idea of expectations via the lens of time, and sometimes what we bring to it. And I mentioned nostalgia earlier, and I think that nostalgia is a very interesting beast in the way that so many properties either seek to return to that or mine it, whether Stranger Things trying to evoke our sense of nostalgia, or Star Wars just like trying to like be Star Wars. But the problem with nostalgia that no one ever talks about is that nostalgia is a personal thing. Everybody's nostalgia is connected to the memories of our growing up, and everybody's circumstances are different. So how do you actually create something that services that for everybody? You can't. And when we look at what our expectations are, Friday 5, I think you're right, is a little trickier because there's 4 movies that came before it that have sort of set the mold, and they're clearly trying to follow in that pattern but deviate. So I could see where there's like a wide turn. But a lot of times when I talk to, like, say, Nightmare fans, just to have, like, a comparison, when people say, well, I didn't like Nightmare 2 because Nightmare 2 was not a Nightmare on Elm Street movie, it's kind of a bizarre thing to say, because when you think about it, there was only one other Nightmare movie to compare it to. So, and now now it's kind of come back around. It's got its own history. There's a documentary coming out about it, which I think is really cool. But it's just sort of like, what do we bring to these movies as well, and how does that affect how we view them? I know there's probably like way more philosophical than we were planning on getting, but I'm just fascinated by that level of engagement, because as horror fans, we all bring that to everything we watch.
I do think there is a collective nostalgia, though. I think, you know, and I agree to your point, like, there's a very personal experience with it, but there's a reason why Stranger Things resonates with so many people of a certain age, because there is like some collective feeling overall that these kind of films evoke in a person, whether it's a Friday the 13th, whether it's an E.T., whether it's you go back and listen to Prince's Purple Rain. There's a collective feeling that like a people kind of feel. How you experience that nostalgia is going to be different for each individual, and that's what personalizes it. I liken it to, like, I work with students. All of them have anxiety. Every single middle school and high school kid right now, you could diagnose them with anxiety. That's a collective experience. How they experience that feeling, that's what makes it personal. That's what makes it unique and individual. So that's, I think there is something to be said, like why there's a collective nostalgia, why these things resonate. But like what we're going to individually pull out of these movies is going to be somewhat different for every single person.
Well, I mean, when people say, when they talk about Friday 5 and they kind of mention that it's so far off from what Friday 13th is, the first film in the series that you get the Jason that we really know and love is the fourth movie. I mean, that's the first movie in the series where it's full on Jason. Mm-hmm. Everything else is kind of like trial and error. Him, the clumsy Jason in 2. The annoyed dad Jason in 3, like we keep mentioning, and he gets his mask halfway and then it goes off. But 4 is the first time we actually get that Jason. So for fans to like really throw 5 away so easily saying that, like, you only had one movie that really felt like Jason. So it's really not, you're really not missing much. And I understand the frustration of not being, not having a lot of Jason. I love Jason with a passion. But 5 is like, there's always one movie in every franchise where there was so much cocaine on that set. And I love those movies because that is the one where that even if it wasn't the best decision, these people were like hopped up out of their mind making like exploitation greatness. And that's what A New Beginning always felt like to me. It's like, man, like you could fill a whole season of like Narcos with just this movie. Like it is, you can almost feel the powder coming off of the lens.
And I think that it's very much on record that drug use was rampant on the set of this film.
I have that bookmarked in here. I'm trying to find that right now here we go. Bob DeSimone, who played, I think it was Bob in the movie. I'm trying to think right now, but he's
Billy, right?
Billy, yes, you're right. Yeah. The male nurse, Billy. So here's a quote from Crystal Lake Memories, which is if you're a Friday the 13th fan, this is a must-have book. Like, everybody should own this book. Part 5 was a set that was riddled with cocaine. It was funny. My scene in the car right before I got the axe in my head, that was basically improvised. The script just said, wow. Billy pulls up and waits outside. No dialogue or anything. Danny said, why don't you go get high in the car and do what you want? So there I am at 3 o'clock in the morning snorting this baby laxative called Mananta, which they used to cut cocaine. And I think I was the only person on the set not snorting the real thing. Producer Stephen Posey, drugs were a presence on the set. It was just part of a lifestyle in those days. It was flamboyant, decadent. Almost everyone on the set has some sort of like cocaine story here.
It's weird and it's funny, and I'm in no way advocating narcotics use. But like it's those movies that that was going on, like it just oozes off of the screen. Mm-hmm. That like growing up, I always loved those movies because they're batshit insane. And for a franchise that had already kind of gotten to that point of being beloved, to have a movie like right in the middle where it's just off the rails. I mean, I've always loved Halloween 3 as well. Are those kind of entries in each franchise. But I mean, Jason isn't in the film per se, but like I feel like in a lot of ways that vibe still is, and yes. I think it's very entertaining.
Absolutely.
Oh, and I loved earlier when you said this feels like the 42nd Street entry of the Friday the 13th, because it does. There's a sleaze to it. It's just like very grindhousey. As you're saying, it has this whole sense that everything about it was just a wild decision. And I don't know, it works for me. I guess in the decade of excess, I want to see an excessive movie, and this delivers that. And that's That's really all I ask.
Mm-hmm.
So can we take 2 minutes and set the table a little bit and look at what Friday the 13th Part 5 comes out against? Like, where is horror at midway through the 80s decade? You know, what many fans consider maybe the best decade of horror movies, the beloved 1980s. 1984 Part 4 comes out and makes about $32 million on a budget of about $3 or $4 million. So $32 million might not sound like a crazy amount of money, but A, it's 1984 money, and then B, it's a return of investment about 10 times what they're actually putting into the movie overall. So even though you're getting the final chapter, within the opening weekend of making $11 million, Paramount's like, we want to do another one of these things. Problem is, by this time, slasher movies are pretty much on their way out. Nightmare on Elm Street debuts in November of that year, but that's a much different looking kind of slasher movie. What you see in 1985 is a lot more classic horror overall, and a lot of really fun experimental things. Tom Holland's Fright Night comes out, one of the best vampire movies of the decade, right damn in the middle of it. Stuart Gordon with Reanimator, with a classic and really nouveau adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft stories. George Romero wraps up his original Dead trilogy with Day of the Dead, but that's outdone by The Return of the Living Dead. The Stuff comes out. Silver Bullets comes out. Tobe Hooper is back with Life Force, which, if someone can explain Life Force to me,
Cocaine.
Please do.
Well, I do.
Drug.
I do know. Speaking of drug movies, but I do know that 5 and Life Force were actually in theaters at the same time. They were that was one of those where it was a parallel run. I think the 3 big horror releases that were out at that first quarter of the year were Life Force, Friday the 13th Part 5, and Cat's Eye. Mm-hmm. And you want to talk about 3 very tonally different movies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, most definitely. I mean, A Cat's Eye is such a good thriller. You know, like it plays in those pawns very well. Whereas, you know, Friday 5, like we've been saying, there's going to be a lot of references to the word cocaine in this episode. I can tell.
Yes.
You know,
cocaine
that one,
and sleaze.
Life Force is. I mean, to be honest, Life Force feels like Friday 13th 5 as far as sleaze, but in space. Like, I love that movie equally. I think it was a really interesting time for horror because, the slasher craze was kind of coming to, not a complete stop because, I don't think it ever went away. It's just maybe the quality dipped. Mm-hmm. But what I love about Friday 5 is that, the slasher movement was kind of, getting quieter. But what did we get from a Friday 13th movie when that was getting quieter? Like the most over the top slasher around. Like, and everything the critics hated about the 4 movies prior is amplified to like the most, just the craziest amount in 5. Like, there isn't nudity. There's basically softcore porn. I mean, it's not only the 42nd Street Friday the 13th, but it's also, I think, the closest to like a Cinemax After Dark Friday the 13th. Mm-hmm. Everything. The kills are over the top, and you could totally tell that this is the first film in the series that really, really, really got the butcher when it, got to the MPAA. I mean, every death, right when it's about to happen, you either get a zoom or, it just cuts. So, I mean, this is like the most extravagant Friday the 13th, I think, until maybe Jason Goes to Hell.
And I would also even go so far as to argue that this is the last, air quote, pure slasher of the franchise of the original Paramount run. Because following this, when, Tom McLaughlin does 6, it's more of an homage to Universal monster movies. Jason comes back as this sort of like Frank and Jason. We've got the supernatural powers of Laura Parker Lincoln's character in 7. And then, whatever the boat adventure of 8 is. But for that original Paramount run, this is the last one that's like just a pure kids at the woods and there's a killer. And I think that it's kind of cool for that original sort of slasher vision that this is the one that amps all of those elements up before it goes into the kind of next wave supernatural territory that it chooses to go. I don't know. The other thing, too, that like rarely gets discussed even though this movie was cut heavily, it's still one of the goriest. It's still one of the most nudity heavy. And you can see the repercussions of this film on later sequels. I know that when John Carl Buechler did Seven, they took an axe to that print. And like there's gore that is completely removed from Seven because they were afraid of MPAA backlash, which I'm sure began with this film.
Well, also, I mean, this is like what the second lowest turnout as far as box office. So I can understand, the risk that this one took. I can understand maybe frightening, producers on the future films because, I mean, this one didn't make that much money when it came out.
Right. It still does well. It does like a little bit over $20 million on a $2 million budget. Mm-hmm. So it does good, but the others have been pulling in closer to $40 million. Mm-hmm. And when you're looking at A Nightmare on Elm Street, which is pulling in big money on huge returns, and it's just getting going at this point, Paramount is starting to get a little bit of gun shy. But I think you're right, Michael. I do think that this particular entry closes the book on the typical slasher movie that you had seen from the series and what we're going to see going forward. So we kind of like affectionately call zombie Jason, supernatural Jason going forward. This is the last kind of like human in a mask. And I think you see that at the end of this movie, like Roy is all busted up and he's hurt. Like you see when he gets hit by the tractor by Reggie the Reckless, and he gets up like he is stunned. He's like, I'm bleeding right now. And I think that anyone in the audience at that point that was expecting it to be Jason, if they still were, should have seen that as a cue that like this is not your typical Friday the 13th right now.
Well, that ends. I mean, on a counterpoint to that, like I also feel like maybe the producers forgot that they took that risk of having a, just Roy as the killer. Because when the end comes down, and, our listeners know that we kind of jump around with the films. But when the ending comes and Roy, not Jason, not this person that's gotten like, an axe to the head and, fingers chopped and his eyeball on a machete, none of that shit. But when we get Roy, a very human, ambulance driver, he gets hit with a tractor, which would break every rib in his body,
right?
Not killing him. He gets that. He gets stabbed. He gets everything. And I think they almost forgot the fact that, like, they chose to have Roy in the movie because he gets put through some stuff that would kill anyone right away. Mm-hmm. And I was watching it earlier today, kind of like a refresher, and, man, I found myself cracking up so much at this movie more than I ever have because I love it. Don't get me wrong, but there's so much just ridiculousness to it, and there are definitely some missteps. I think it's one of the most frustrating sequels to me in the sense that I really don't care about any of the characters. Definitely none of the main protagonists. The only two characters that I genuinely care about in the movie are Reggie and Demon. Because that chemistry and there's like just this sincerity with those two, especially Shavar Ross as Reggie. I mean, I think he's up there. He's up there with Ginny or, Tommy or any of the characters that I think are some of the fan favorites. Reggie the Reckless, I think, steals the entire movie. And I kind of wish that Reggie, and if Demon hadn't died, I wish those two would have gotten their own spinoff.
In a perfect world.
Right?
But I don't. Yeah, in the 80s, I don't think they were. You see, the industry still is taking baby steps at casting non-white leads. So I think that. But how badass would that have been? I think it's interesting too that you said it feels like at times they forget why was supposed to be the reveal of this movie, because I 100% agree with that, because from a screenwriting or storytelling perspective, this definitely just feels like there are moments where the reveal of Roy, I do remember many friends and audience members being like, wait, who's that guy? Because we really only see him at the beginning. And it kind of reminds me of that, in a way, it's also a Giallo entry into the world of Friday the 13th, because that's a very Argento move to like make the black-gloved killer be revealed to be like the lady in the phone booth who we walked by once. And you're supposed to like just remember that. It's a bonkers move, and I don't know. I kind of respect it for that reason.
I remember as a kid the first time I saw it, and I think I saw 5 later in the game. I think I watched most of them prior to that. I think maybe I was like 12. 11, 12, 13 when I saw 5. And I remember just wondering what the hell is going on with these like random close-ups on the ambulance driver. You know, like his partner says something about, you know, when Joey dies, and suddenly it just close up to Roy. And I remember as a kid, like, it was the most obvious, you know, hey, here's the killer in a film full of red herrings. But I mean, there's so many obvious nods or kind of references to this is the killer. But as a kid, I was more kind of annoyed by those, to where, like, when it finally did show Roy, I was like, oh, I get it now, but it's still somewhat underwhelming.
Right.
Well, I think, too, that Roy only has one other moment in the film when he's doing the cleanup and carrying off, like, the remains of, like, the two dudes that got stranded and then got murdered.
And he's really excited?
Yeah. And he's basically, like, it's such a 180 from his performance, you know, or from his take, like one scene before when Joey's body is revealed, where he's like horrified, and this one he's like, talking to me, Sheriff, you know, just like all happy-go-lucky, and
well, it's almost like, you know, there was like this sense of satisfaction that he just killed these two greaser kids.
Yeah.
And what's funny about that, and it's another thing I kind of noticed on a revisit today, is Roy really worked fast. I mean, this is not Sandra dying in part 2 and what's supposed to be the same weekend, you know, Rob in 4 going to look for his sister and having like an encyclopedia knowledge of Jason.
Mm-hmm.
In this one, Roy finds out Joey dies, and right away, the very next scene, you know, he's pretty much ready to go killing these, you know, these rockabilly guys. Which is funny in itself because, I mean, I'm from the Central Valley of California, and if there's ever an area where people think they're stuck in the 50s, it's around here. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that rockabilly people are kind of like all up in their, you know, their friend's ass. Like, they're obsessed with their friends. But this movie, those two guys hate each other.
They really
like,
do.
It is so verbally abusive between those friends. It's like, shit, dude, kill these guys already. No, but what I'm saying is, like, Roy, if you really think about it, like, Roy pretty much right away that same night went out, bought a jumpsuit, knew all about Jason's MO, bought a mask, bought a machete, you know, bought like basically the mask equivalent of a bald cap to come off like Jason. Like, there's a lot of preparation that he just instantly jumped on, which leads to like, why wasn't Joey in his care? Why did he ditch out on him? Like, what was going on with Roy that he would snap so quick?
Why does he have a picture of Joey that's like 2 weeks old?
Wouldn't Matt and Pam and the rest of the people know who Roy was if there's like this active communication between Joey and Roy?
Yeah, that was always my biggest sticking point, is like, how do they not know that that's Joey's dad? Because first off, anyone who's ever lived in small town America, of which Crystal Lake and whatever this adjacent neighborhood is supposed to be, knows that everyone knows everybody else. Not to mention, it's supposed to be a mental facility. Someone check that kid in. So, like, when the ambulance shows up and they were like, oh, oops, maybe we should tell Roy before he pulls off the blanket and sees his dead son. Like, I kind of feel like that would have been just, again, I kind of feel like this is one of those, they were towards the end of the script and they were like, aha, what if we reveal this now? And no one went back to do that. Because Agatha Christie famously would just write the book and at the end write who the killer was. And then in her second draft would go through and make adjustments. I feel like that's what happened here. They just didn't go through and make adjustments.
Yeah, for sure. And, I mean, picking out these kind of like really bad plot holes, I hope none of the listeners think that, you know, I'm slamming it, because those are also little quirks that make me love the movie even more. Mm-hmm. Like, if I can find a slasher movie that makes me laugh and scratch my head at the same time, like, I think that's a win. And I think this movie of the entire series is the one where you're constantly asking yourself, what the fuck is going on?
Right.
Like, I mean, not in like the way that, and I'm going to keep referencing Jason Goes to Hell. I'm not a fan of that movie whatsoever, but, you know, we'll get to that. But, like, it's not in the sense that, like, oh, you know, we're going to make Jason a worm that possesses people. But it's in the sense that, like, we don't know what we're doing. We're high off our asses. We're trying to make a Friday the 13th movie without Jason, but kind of have it be Jason. Like, there's so much. It's like throwing like everything and the kitchen sink into a movie. And I think it's part of the charm of A New Beginning.
For sure.
It absolutely is. And I think that charm, as it is, like that mix of charm and sleaze, starts at the top with Danny Steinman. So let's talk a little bit about what Mr. Steinman brings to the table here as a director of the movie. So, Michael, you had mentioned before, like, he had gotten his start in making adult movies. But let's keep in mind that, so did Sylvester Stallone. Wes Craven worked in adult films as well. Like, it didn't always have this kind of feel of it had to be sleazy, and it was, if you appeared in porn or worked in porn, your career was pretty much at a dead end at that point. Like it was for so long.
No, and I think the era of adult cinema and 42nd Street cinema as it stood then, as opposed to post the home video boom, the kind of attitudes about how we interacted with X-rated movies and pornography is a little different, which is interesting because you would assume that, like, now it's more progressive than it would have been then, and in some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't. But there was something sort of chic about pornography back in the day. And I think, too, like, I had done an interview with Tom DeSimone, who directed Hell Night and Reform School Girls a number of years ago. And what a lot of people didn't know until he had started choosing to talk about it in interviews is that Tom DeSimone came from a world not only of pornography, but he had directed a lot of gay pornography before it was even legal to do so. So he was knowingly breaking the law to create this content, and he made upwards of, I think, of like 55 adult motion pictures. And when I talked to him about it, he told me that, for a lot of filmmakers, and this is something I've heard people like David Dakota reiterate, and I had even read an interview once where Wes Craven said something to a similar standpoint. Of course, there's something titillating about making these movies, but more so for these people who were so passionate about making movies, this was literally film school. It was the idea of, I can go out and make a movie and learn how all of this works and learn how to make movies by doing. And they did. And so Tom DeSimone says, like, I took the skills of learning how to shoot a scene quickly and, like, do creative cuts and creative edits from the time that I made adult films and brought it to, like, when I would go out for movies in the mainstream. And at the time where, like, not everything was connected to your name on the internet, they could go and do it. And then, like, by the time they had made their career, it didn't matter. And so I think that Danny Steinman, probably much like these guys who was working in 42nd Street, was testing out stuff. And if you've ever seen his notable adult movie that he made, it's this porn movie called High Rise, which I have seen. High Rise is a movie that the plot is that it's a woman who is seeing a sex therapist she's not having a good relationship with her husband in the way that they're not having as much sex as she thinks they ought to because she feels she's closed off. And her therapist, in a very porno way, says, your assignment to become more open with yourself and the world around you is to go to a high-rise apartment building in New York and you just fuck your way from the first floor all the way to the penthouse. And that seems very that's literally the plot of the movie. And it could be as sleazy in your brain as you want it to be, but what I failed to mention, and I kind of held back on purpose, is this movie is a musical. And there are musical numbers, and there's dance sequences, and, like, crazy, like, set pieces that if he just wanted to set out to make a straight, and by that I mean, like, linear porn movie where someone just had this, like, sex scene to sex scene to sex scene, he didn't. He made a movie that just happens to have sex in it. And what I'm looking at is seeing a guy who wanted to make a movie that just happened to have sex. So I feel like Danny Steinman kind of, unfortunately, when compared to other Friday directors, gets this bad rep because he directed porn. And, for some people, it depends on your opinion on it. That's fine. But I'm also like, well, he made a creative porn, which means, to me, he was a filmmaker who was trying to do some stuff.
Well, I've always tried to fight the stigma that comes with people that are in that field. I made a film in 2016 called Love is Dead, a short film. And out of the 3-person cast, 2 of them are adult film stars. Joanna Angel and Aaron Thompson, who goes by Smallhounds. They both do, adult films for Burning Angel. And I cast them not because, I was a huge fan of their adult film work, just because, like, in a lot of those films, especially I think the ones that Burning Angel does, they're very plot-based, and you see that these people can act. You know, that they choose to make adult films because it's just what, you know, their profession and what they enjoy doing. But they are talented, and I think a lot of people never give people like that a chance. You know, like when two other filmmaker friends, Zach Showalter and BJ Colangelo, came down to help me produce the film. And while we were shooting Love is Dead, like, we were taken back with how great of actors both of them were. And I don't mean like, you know, the really cliche asshole thing, you know, like, oh, they're good for porn stars. No, they were great actors, to the point where, like, we were in tears watching, you know, Joanna Angel break down in the scene in the shower. Like, it was hard to watch. And I think people like them, or people like Danny Steinman and stuff, there was a stigma that they had to start in adult films, you know, but I also feel like the same stigma goes to, like, people in comedy trying to do horror. I mean, when it was announced that Danny McBride and David Gordon Green were doing a Halloween film, I mean, everyone jumped at, like, wanting to tear that to shreds. And that came out my second favorite film in the entire series. Or, you know, Jordan Peele doing Get Out or Us. Jordan Peele is like a horror encyclopedia. That guy is such a huge fan that I think people don't realize that just because you're known for one thing, that you can't excel at another.
No, it's true. And I think that, too, it's that throwing the onus of reputation, whatever that means, onto something is preposterous. I mean, like, one of the great joys, and I said this at the beginning when I was talking about my love of horror, I love that we, to all extents and purposes, embody an otherness. It's a genre of outsiders, and I say that in the way that all of the people that I know who have come to this genre with a genuine love for it, and by proxy have formed this community that by and large has genuine love for one another. No one who came to this genre in some way or another, I don't think, didn't feel like an outsider at one point. We connected to this horror genre because we could see that otherness embodied, and we understood that otherness, and we celebrated that otherness. So it bothers me when people all of a sudden take this high and mighty tract like, well, they don't belong here. Because it's sort of like, remember what this is and remember where you came from. And with regard to people from the world of adult cinema, you know, Marilyn Chambers in Rabbit gave one of the greatest David Cronenberg performances, and she came from the world of adult films. You know, Ginger Lynn Allen, I remember, had a run of great comedies that used to play on USA Up All Night, the Vice Academy movies, and this just idea that, you're right. I think that, you know, just to put someone in a box is unfair, and sort of also is against the very tenets by which we all come to this genre.
Well, I think, too, you see even now, like with, you know, Darcy the Mail Girl, a.k.a. Diana Prince, who had a run in adult filmmaking. Like, she's an integral part of Shudder's Joe Bob Briggs' The Last Drive-In. And I would say that show would, you know, I think we'd still love it, but I don't think it would be half as good as it is right now, because you see her keep him in check and kind of stand up to him, and not kind of when he goes on some of his a little bit problematic rants every now and again, but she's also like a you know, real lover of the genre. She really knows her shit. She's run a site called Kinky Horror for years, which is like a lot of great material in there, and a lot of great writing, and a lot of great writers have passed through that site. So, you know, Michael, I think to your point, and Jerry, to your point, like, horror or just really art in general is better when it's more inclusive, when you get different points of view, and you get different performances, when you kind of look outside your standard box and let everybody kind of tell their stories and share their perceptions. It allows for a lot more empathy, and it allows for a lot, kind of like a broader way of thinking. I did not think we would go in this direction, talking about Friday the 13th Part 5, where we'd be bringing up empathy, but here we are.
Well, I think that it even goes as far as the people who act in these films. A lot of them take it because they want to act, and then they later talk about how awful they thought it came out. I mean, John Shepard, who plays, you know, Tommy Jarvis in Part 5. I mean, he spent a long time volunteering at a state hospital preparing for the role when he was cast under the title of Repetition. I mean, he thought he was gonna, he thought it was basically gonna win him an award, and then he finds out it's a Friday the 13th movie, and he has nothing but kind of contempt to say about it, until the convention era comes, and he's getting paid $20 to write his name, or the actor that played Roy, he's called the film trash many times. It's just I think there's this kind of looking down on the genre that so many people kind of, unfortunately, within the series had, and they didn't realize that, this isn't high art. But at the same time, I think the fan base and the admiration towards these films is unparalleled by any other genre. There's I'm not dissing Nicholas Sparks stuff because, I've read The Wedding probably 8 times. But there will never be a convention of romantic comedies or dramas. You know what I mean? Like you go to horror conventions, and there is every kind of walk of life. There's every nationality, every orientation, every kind of individual will be there because they love the genre with a passion. And I think the horror in general gets looked down on. But when you get a film like A New Beginning, where it is just demolished by critics even more than the other films. Like, there is something about even this film that has heart. It's sleazy. It's one of the cruelest films in the series, I think. It has zero regard for its protagonist whatsoever. Like the character of Matt, or the characters of Matt and Pam. They run this home for the troubled youth kind of thing. And if there are 2 characters in the series that genuinely care about doing what's right or helping people, it's those 2 characters. Yes. I mean, they're getting nonstop stuff from was it Ethel?
Ethel and Junior.
Ethel and Junior. They're getting nonstop crap from them, from the sheriff. The mayor is on the sheriff's ass. But Matt and Pam, they see stuff in these kids that no one else does. But what happens? We just come across Matt with a huge nail or something in his head.
He's got a railroad spike through his head, and you don't even get the kill on screen.
Not at all. He's basically the Miss Jarvis of Part 5. And it's just like, this film has no regard for its characters. The death of Joey, I think, is one of the meanest kills in the entire series. Because, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a little rant here, so I apologize to our listeners. But anyone who listened to the Part 3 episode, I will fight for Shelley till the end. That character I loved because he wasn't a character that was trying to be annoying. He tried so hard to be liked that it came across the opposite. And if there's a character that takes that and amplifies it, it's Joey. Yeah, he's annoying. Yeah, he's frustrating. But all he is, he's basically Shelley on coke. Again.
Well, Joey...
He tries so well, but just bombs horribly.
Joey is a little bit... when I watch this movie again, I've worked with intellectually disabled adults for a few years, and Joey immediately reminded me of one particular individual I worked with who, very good person. I've taken him to breakfast with my family before, love him to death, but complete and utter unable to recognize any sort of social cues whatsoever. And it's funny, the actor who played him, Dominic Braskia, has said he was written as special needs when I got the script, but I wanted to play him as normal. And I'm like, ooh, buddy, you didn't. You failed in that one.
I don't think – okay, and this is where we're going to get a little intense. The thing about that dude, Dominic – as a victim, or not victim, because fuck that, survivor of sexual assault as a kid, it's hard for me to watch Part 5 these days. Because anyone who doesn't know, that is the man that, as of right now, is kind of being classified as the man who raped Corey Haim. I mean, this guy was in a lot of ways, a pedophile. So, it's hard when these films have people like that kind of have, some sketchy behind the scenes behavior. But to say that he wanted to play him as normal, I mean, maybe it's the early 80s where, you know, the whole like being woke didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But even as a father of like 2 special needs children,
Mm-hmm.
like what the fuck? Like,
Yeah.
I hate that, like, oh, you know, I don't want to play him as, you know, challenged. I want to play him as normal. Like even that statement, even in the 80s, like it kind of shows kind of what a piece of shit the dude was.
But he plays him as challenge, and he plays it for laughs. Like, that's the thing about that character. There's no...
It's
You're not
exploited.
meant to feel... Yes, that's exactly it. Like, you're not meant to sympathize for Joey outside of him. Like, when he gets that axe to the back, like, I think you're meant to cheer that as an audience. Really, the way like he plays that character.
And I think that speaks to like another thing that is not discussed as much as it ought to be. And I'm with you, Jerry, and the way the discussion about the actor. I think that, you know, with the lens of time and the problematic history and revelations about Corey Feldman that we know, it makes it difficult to engage with that character now, knowing what we know or what has been put forth. So I'm going to kind of, just for the sake of the conversation, put that in a box to the side for the second, just to discuss the presentation of the fictional character and sort of where we're at this moment in time and how characters like this were handled. There is still this issue, and it prevails today. But like what we're looking at is sort of sizist humor. Like, you know, he's a slobby, larger man who could not in any way, shape, or form be presented as likable. He's got to have chocolate on his face, and he can't be clean, and there's like he's rubbing food on things. And you're supposed to be like, ha, look at the gross, messy, fat guy, and then they make him extra annoying on top of that. So it's sort of just like a one-dimensional stereotype that they wanted to present to get us from point A to point B. And that sort of is where these movies do fail sometimes, in the way that they just take stereotypical ideas and kind of the cruel presentation that we have with certain stereotypes just to shoehorn different things into the movies. And that was something to me during this rewatch where I was just like, okay, this is kind of like, there's a little sizist cruelty more than anything.
Well, that and when it comes to Vic, the character of Vic, you know, Mark Venturini, who, I mean, unfortunately passed away very early on. I mean, he was great in this movie, the one scene he's in, and I mean, he's one of my favorite characters in Return of the Living Dead. But speaking on that, like, where was Vic's background check? Like, nobody just instantly chops someone up for a candy bar with having some, like, serious, you know, I hate to use the word issues because, I mean, I don't like, you know, calling anyone with mental illness, you know, like different. Like it's something that everyone struggles with. But for someone to chop someone up with with an axe over a candy bar, there's some serious things going on.
Right.
That it's not the same as, you know, Violet being kind of like a rebel who wants to, you know, pop and lock.
Right. Well, I think, you know, you bring up, I think maybe the biggest flaw of the film overall is everybody fits in this very small little circle. Like Violet is kind of like your rebellious punk. Joey is the annoying person. Vic is your psychopath. You know, you have Debbie Sue Voorhees character who's like, she's like the sex pot of the movie overall. And you contrast that with what we had in part 4, which, you know, I think we spent the bulk of our part 4 episode talking about how great these characters were, how fully developed they were, how you know, if you took the horror movie elements out of it, you had a great like teen sex comedy. And all of that is kind of like ripped away from this movie. And it's just like, beat by beat by beat is what you're going through, with maybe a little bit more quirkiness thrown in as opposed to like having a fully developed personality. Now you have Ethel, who is just weird.
And also, I mean, growing up, any small issues I had with 5 stemmed from that stuff and not the lack of Jason. I like I said, I enjoy 5 as just like a entertaining movie on its own. Mm-hmm. But what really, even growing up, like made me feel kind of weird about it at times is how it did have that jump. You go from 4, and I will probably, and I'm sorry, but I'll probably end up saying this every episode, listeners. You go from 4, where if you take Jason out, still a great coming-of-age movie. to 5, where, like I said, the only two characters that you really, really care about, Reggie and Demon. I mean, even Matt and Pam, who are great characters, they're not really given much to work with. As far as, like, you know, and I think the whole final girl kind of label is kind of, you know, I use the word problematic in itself. But when it comes to that kind of setup and that kind of character trope, I also think Melanie Kinnaman, who played Pam, she was good in what she had, but, like, I think maybe Steinman and the writers of the film kind of focused on meeting that quota of, you know, deaths and sex, that they kind of maybe skimmed over character development in a lot of places.
Right. The one area that I will give Steinman and company credit for is this is the first Friday the 13th film where you do have African-American characters in it, period. I mean, part 3, you have Ali is the, you know, kind of like pseudo-villain for a little bit of it, but, you know, this is the first one where you have maybe a little bit of depth here in representation to characters overall, with Grandpa, with Reggie the Reckless, and with Demon, and even in the characterization. Now I'm going to kind of like do a 180 of what I just said, but like Miguel Nunez in that really brief, like 5 minutes on screen, they could have played him like a lot harder, a lot tougher, like he's the bad boy that Reggie's not allowed to go see, but there's like this genuine warmth and camaraderie between the two brothers there, and you can see how like Demon wanted to look out for Reggie overall and how much affection there was there. This is the first Friday the 13th movie to actually do that. Like, that's one area that none of the other films, I think, really have that representation in any way, shape, or form.
That scene in particular reminds me of the scene, and this is weird because they're completely different characters, but the scene from the final chapter with the whole Jarvis family coming in for the hug.
Yeah.
You know, like, Demon is supposed to be a badass, but Demon and his girlfriend are two of the sweetest characters in the entire film. I mean, right when Reggie leaves, first thing Demon says is how much he's going to miss his little brother.
Yeah.
And can we just take a second and just really addressing the fact that scene has some of the funniest dialogue in the entire series? I mean, you know, Reggie leaves. Reggie leaves, and like Demon's trying to be all like, he's sad, trying to like confide in his girlfriend, and he talks about how he's gonna miss her, and she's like, yeah, he's a cutie pie. Want to hit this? And holds up a joint. Like, it's hilarious. Or Demon's on the toilet, and he's trying to be tough to his girlfriend who's trying to spook him, and his delivery is just so like non-confrontational. He's like, you know, you're gonna get it, bitch.
Go right and get it, bitch.
It sounds so like a Chappelle Show character. Like, I love it. It's hilarious.
Yeah, I do too. And then they start singing a cappella to one another, which who doesn't do that? I mean, I can't tell you the number of mornings that I've been on the crapper and my wife and I just bust out in song with one another.
Oh, good.
So those damn empanadas.
Just that whole family dynamic. You know, I think the grandfather was another character that is one of the few characters that when they die, you actually do feel bad. Because when it comes to, it's another off-screen death. When you see it, I mean, he wasn't just like stabbed. Like, his eyes are missing. You know, he's bloody as hell. Like, when the good people get it in this film, they get it bad.
I'm wondering too, I'm kind of fascinated by this idea that I've been thinking about this while this conversation has been going on, that maybe, you know, despite the one-dimensional presentation of some of the characters, that this is one of the few Friday movies that really deals with the idea of repercussions and trauma in the way that we sort of see what happens afterwards. And it's something that I've talked about before in other contexts with this idea of slasher sequels. And I realize it's not big budget box office appeal to show like what trauma you would go through the next day. But, you know, the idea that like when Sydney goes to college in Scream 2, she's just like, you know, I now have caller ID, but I'm going to go to theater class. No, your life would be ruined. You would be mentally destroyed by that. I mean, some people are more resilient than others, but it takes a while to kind of pick up the pieces of something like this. And, you know, even Alice, after the first movie in part 2, she's a little skittish, but she's living on her own, and she seems okay. You know, I kind of am fascinated that part 5 is one of the first ones to really show how much the presence of Jason affected Tommy Jarvis. And then by extension, when he goes to the home with all the other kids, what you're talking about, each one of them, we're sort of getting a window into their lives briefly. The idea that Reggie has this sort of connection with Demon, and Demon really always wanted to look out for his brother, but he can't because of the circumstances. I don't know. Like, I don't know that was maybe like intentional trauma and pathos built in, but the more I think about it, the more I kind of like that read, because it gives me a little more affinity for the characters, because this movie literally takes place at a home for people who are recovering in various ways from the trauma they lived with, whether we as the audience know what that is or not.
I've always been fascinated by films, especially in the slasher or horror genre, that do deal with that, because, I mean, I'm pretty open about having had a very abusive childhood, and that kind of trauma, it stays with you. It stays with you your entire life. I mean, I'm almost 40 now, and it's still something I deal with on a daily basis. But when films are bold enough to do that, I mean, yeah, it's Friday the 13th Part 5, but you're right. It does do that. It doesn't. I don't think it's as successful as other films were, and I think the Halloween series in particular was maybe the slasher franchise that tried to do that the most. I mean, you have Halloween H2O, which, I mean, I'll probably get crucified for saying this, I'm not a big fan of, but I think that the intention of trying to, you know, show what would happen to Laurie Strode after that, after the events of Halloween, it's interesting. But then you have like Rob Zombie's Halloween 2, where it shows that trauma and it approaches it in a way that I think fails. I mean, Laurie Strode ends up being like, you know, having she has tattoos now and a Charles Manson poster and dreadlocks, that she cusses a lot and she hates everyone. Like, it's weird. And, you know, you have the newest Halloween, which I think is a really good, really solid look at trauma. But like you said, Friday the 13th 5 is one of the first kind of slasher films that did that. And I think that's where, you know, I did mention that, you know, maybe not a lot of the characters you kind of care for, but I still think that below that, kind of just below the surface, there is a lot of heart to this film.
Yeah.
And I do give the film credit because it doesn't take the easy route where all signs pointing to Tommy being your next killer overall, although that's kind of the ending that you get. But you're supposed to look at someone who's completely broken, and the signs are pointing to him maybe being the person behind everything, and it's really ends up not being that throughout the movie. And you see, you know, John Shepherd really, with minimal dialogue, just everything done through his face and his body language, and just like the moments where he's prone to this really sharp, quick violence overall. Like, he basically turns into Johnny, the dude from the Karate Kid, who I can't think of his name right now. But he basically just turns into like a street fighter, basically, in this movie. And I think that's a really interesting take on the character. And it's not what you get in Part 6.
No, not at all. And I that's funny that you say that, because on my notes today when I was rewatching it, the question was, when did Tommy, you know, turn into a character from Street Fighter 2? Mm-hmm. But no, I like that. And there's a scene in the film that probably maybe I always read into too much. But the whole film, there's all these little kind of nods to maybe Tommy is the killer. I mean, he's kind of losing it as the film goes on, a little more and more. He's getting more violent. He's having visions. I mean, he's getting very anxiety-filled and everything. And you kind of start to think that he is the killer. I mean, it kind of goes that route for a while. But there's one scene where, you know, pseudo Jason is coming after Reggie and Pam. And Reggie looks down, and Tommy just kind of runs up into the rain and looks there. And it's that small just running up, and the look that Reggie gives him, that even as a viewer, you see it, and you get this kind of like kind of pride. You're proud of the fact that Tommy didn't break and he's not that person. And that's what makes the very end kind of twist thing, you know, where he's standing there at the mask. I've always despised that ending.
Right. Because
that whole arc of a damaged person having that crossroad in front of them to where they could go, you know, to the left and be that violent person that, you know, they were exposed to with Jason and that trauma, or they could rise above that. I think that small little scene shows such a good character arc, and kind of part 5 to me attempted to be this kind of conclusion to this great character that we got in 4. And I don't think it works 100%, but little things like that does. I think part 6, maybe that Tommy Jarvis is kind of the conclusion that we really want. But I do love that arc in 5 that you get with John Shepard's portrayal.
No, I think, Shepard is kind of the odd man out when we talk about the Tommy Jarvis trilogy. We all remember Corey, for obvious reason, Corey Feldman, and we also, think really highly of Tom Matthews' portrayal, but Shepard gets left out. He kind of has the least amount to do, but I think he does the most with what he's given overall. I think it's a pretty kind of fascinating performance overall.
Well, I think it takes 15 to 20 minutes of the movie before he actually has a full sentence of a line.
Yes. So, but I love that, that introduction overall. They remind the audience of, when Reggie and Tommy meet one another, and Reggie is kind of like, I'm the reckless, and he's like kind of giving Tommy a bunch of shit, and then Tommy puts on the mask and scares the hell out of Reggie right away. Like, I just love that little moment. Like, there's still a little bit of that kind of punk kid that's there in him.
Well, that, and I think in a lot of ways, Tommy that's kind of, I think, why he kind of latches onto Reggie. I think Tommy sees himself from the Part 4 era in Reggie. Mm-hmm. Tommy's very standoffish at first, with the masks, and then Reggie kind of calls him on it, you acting like you made this yourself kind of thing, and he explains that he did. And I think they're kind of, that kinship, that friendship kind of is based out of that, Tommy being standoffish at first and then kind of seeing himself in Reggie.
Yeah. What do we think of this through line through the movie where the sheriff is convinced it's Jason, and the mayor is kind of pushing back? Like, you have that scene with the mayor where he's really going all in and over the top, say, like, this is your Jason Voorhees, like, and he pours the cigar ash into his hand. What do we think of that kind of through line through the film where there's kind of hints that it might be Jason, but,
Well, I think that maybe I think this is the worst thing you could do for a franchise. Because whether or not they planned on, this whole new trilogy where there would be a different killer every, that's fine. Whether or not they planned on that, putting themselves in a box by saying, Jason was cremated, like, looking back, and I'm not like the continuity police with these movies. I mean, I love the Texas Chainsaw movies, but I also think it has the worst continuity of any film series in the world.
Right.
But, I mean, little things like talking about how Jason was cremated and a bunch of other stuff, like, it puts it into a box that, when you get Jason Lives and he's, right there, it kind of makes 5 look even worse. But the idea that maybe tricking the audience into thinking that, it could be Jason or, it could be someone else, I think it's an interesting approach, to say the least. Yeah.
Well, I do think that, too, despite continuity flaws, there's a fascinating kind of duality that exists between 5 and 6, where both 5 and 6 open exactly the same. The idea of Tommy going to Jason's grave on a rainy night, and what I think was very kind of prescient of what Tom McLaughlin does in the next movie is, I think, opening it the exact same way that 5 did was a calculated move, and beyond just giving them the opportunity to do their sort of like Universal Monster take on it. I think because they knew fans were cranky after 5, they sort of were like, look, we're literally kind of giving you a reboot right from the get-go of how we did the last movie. But what's fascinating then, too, is when you look at 5 and the idea that it's the sheriff who thinks that Jason's back and no one wants to listen. Then in 6, like, Tommy is so very, like, vehemently trying to tell the sheriff, and the sheriff won't listen. It's sort of just franchise construction-wise, I think there's a lot more synergy between these two movies than fans give credit to. And I do think it allows for a really interesting evolution of Tommy Jarvis's character. Of course, there are beats that are missing between 5 and 6 that show us, where Tommy is and how he became the Tom Matthews version that we know. But I don't know. I think that it would have been interesting in an alternate reality to see where this franchise would have gone if 5 had been commercially successful and they had spun it into a new trilogy of movies, with 5 being the beginning and Tommy being the killer of 6 and vice versa.
Well, that ends. I also think that the filmmaking team behind the 5th movie, kind of speaking on what I said earlier about kind of abandoning or kind of forgetting the idea of, the direction that they had chosen to go. With Roy especially, I think there's it's disjointed a lot of the time. And, I don't want to turn this into just trashing the movie because I'm a big fan of it. But everything from Tommy just being so different than he was in 4 to, like I said, the stuff at the end, Roy getting kind of banged up in a way that only Jason would. It's interesting because I feel like that's a big reason why fans kind of were turned off by it, is that it gave them shades of what they had seen before, and that it's exciting, but it also went in directions that felt really alien and weird and kind of awkward.
Yeah, and I would say one of the really most awkward things about the movie is I can't place the setting of it in relation to the 4 movies that came before it. Even more so than Part 3, this does not look anything like a camp area in New Jersey. Well, this looks like Southern California.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you say that, because I asked earlier on Twitter if anyone had any questions for this episode, and our friends at the Kill by Kill podcast, they're always quick to ask some really fun questions. Mm-hmm. And one of them is, their question, word for word, was, where in the worldwide sports or whatever it is, does this maybe take place? And that was something I've always wondered. But then our, Nat Brimmer from last episode obviously knew exactly where it takes place. And so he had this to say, and I wrote it down, I think, word for word here. Nat definitely knows exactly where it takes place. Basically, the mayor and the police captain, when they're arguing, they talk about Jason's grave like it's local. And in Part 3, it mentions that they're in Pinehurst County. So the fact that, Nat was basically saying that it's not Crystal Lake. It's another city within the same county. So I understand it looking a little different, but it's dusty. It's just so different than a New Jersey or, an area like that.
I saw that question as well when you had tweeted it, and I must confess that I kind of slid over to the Blu-rays and I popped the 6 in, because I know at the beginning of 6, when Tommy goes in to tell the sheriff after the opening credits, that Jason's back, the sheriff is like, "You're that Tommy Jarvis kid. You were in some psych ward." And the sheriff in 6 directly references the fact that the psych ward is somewhere not in town. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering too, this is some deep nerd stuff. I'm wondering too if when Tommy arrives in the van has the label Unger, which might be the name of the town that they're in. Because Pinehurst is the name of the home that they're at, which I would assume be named for the county. So they just might be a couple towns over in the same county.
So, from a logistical standpoint, I understand it's not in Crystal Lake, so maybe it'll look different. But the fact, I'm born and raised in California. I've lived here my entire life. It's very California-like in this movie.
Right.
But also, I was trying to make a point earlier, and I kind of got stumbled because of this awful heat. But when it comes to, the producers not kind of knowing where they wanted to go with the film, 5, to me, it offers exposition in a way that we hadn't seen before. In the previous films, we got that right up front, and it wasn't to explain what you just saw because you have no idea what you just saw. It was to bring you up to speed of all the entries before. In 5, you get that at the very end after the Roy reveal. They go into detail about, this is why he did it. This is it. And I almost feel like it was from a screenwriting perspective, like, oh no, maybe we need to explain exactly what the hell we just showed the audience. What do you guys think about the actual the kids in the home? Because I mean, yeah, I mentioned kind of this one-dimensional take on a lot of the characters, and a lot of them, they kind of come off as caricatures of certain stereotypes. And the one that drives me nuts, it wasn't Joey per se, because I just feel like that was a horrible misstep in general. But the one that's as a character that drove me nuts is the character of Jake, because it's very subtle, and for some reason 38 years old, and I just picked this up for the first time today. There's that scene where Jake is kind of, talking about his feelings for Robin when they're watching, the movie, and Robin's not kind of getting the hint that Jake's into her. And finally, when he's upfront about it, that he wants to be with her, he doesn't just follow it with like, oh, I have feelings with you. He follows it with basically he just wants to have sex with her.
Yes.
And she turns him down, and he does what most, unfortunately, and I know I'm going to get a lot of bros being pissed at me if they like the show, but unfortunately he does what a lot of straight white males tend to do when they don't get the response that they want. He instantly starts yelling at her that, he was joking. He's making it up. He's not attracted to her. And it gave me this weird feeling today watching it that like it's almost like it felt like he was trying to tear her down, saying that, she's not attractive because he got rejected. And it reminded me of something that happened, and I won't go into detail about this because I don't want to take up a long time. But something happened around here to a friend of mine that I know. She's a model. She was at a bar with her friends, and this guy came up to her, tried to hit on her, and she said she's not interested, very polite. And being that kind of like straight white male stereotype, what did he do? He took a glass and slammed it into her face, leading to needing plastic surgery and everything else. And I feel like the characters like Jake, those are the people that end up doing shit like that. Mm-hmm. And those are the characters that really just kind of irk me. Like I said, the Joey character was, I think, just a horrible misstep in general. Right. But especially in 5, like there are these characters that just come off very scummy. I mean, even the character of Billy, you're not supposed to like him, but I mean, a lot of these characters come off like there's something just very, just deep rooted like anger towards women, even more than other entries.
Well, I want to talk about Ethel in a minute, but getting back to Jake, one thing I noticed when I watched this movie Sunday morning, and I never picked up on it before, he immediately, after getting rejected, goes to Violet's room. And it's like, I need to talk to you. And you know that he's going to pull the same shtick right there after getting rejected. Like, he just wanted to get laid, and he didn't care with who it was. So he's like, all right, this person rejected me. Who's next on the assembly line? And it makes it difficult to have any sympathy for him whatsoever.
Well, not only that, because I think that's definitely what he did, but at the same time, another possibility is that he could do what a lot of men unfortunately do, is they get rejected and they go to that person's best friend and say a bunch of shit about that person to try to make them look better. And that's another thing that always kind of it made me think of that when I think of that character of Jake.
I mean, I would like to think that they were woke enough in 1984 when they were shooting this movie to have that as a commentary on toxic masculinity and aggression, and it definitely reads that way. I don't know if that was the intent, but I think too, that like honesty, where just being honest, honesty for honesty's sake. There are a number of characters across the Friday the 13th franchise who we, as audience members, know are merely exist as fodder, and we're not supposed to like them. And I feel like I definitely don't mind Jake dying because he is kind of a piece of shit character. And I think that this franchise is always good at sort of affecting that balance of having kind of like the asshole to good person ratio. They know that if everyone's terrible, you're not going to connect with the movie at all, and or you don't care about any of the characters, so you're not going to have that fist pump of victory when they take back the night. But alternatively, they know that if you love everybody, it's going to be like a very miserable watching everybody die. So it's sort of like, one thing that I always talk about when I discuss this franchise is that there is something to be said about how this franchise specifically always kind of veers into the territory of punishment of the popular kids, i.e. the kids who would be the bullies. Like it's always kind of like the jocks and the cheerleader types who are overly sexualized and mean and treat the like, you know, Ginny's sort of a tomboy, or like, you know, the idea that like some of the other characters are outsiders and not the popular kids, and they're made to feel not popular. Jason always takes those the bullies out first. And that's sort of like, I think, kind of what nestles you back into this world.
I also think that maybe we were spoiled with the final chapter in the sense that even the assholes had a lot of humanity to them. I mean, the character of Ted, you know, he was in a lot of ways, you know, somewhat of a bully to, you know, Crispin Glover's character. But at the same time, there was heart to know that he was kind of, for the most part, just joking around with his friend. And when Ted got rejected, I mean, he didn't act out on the women that rejected him. I mean, if anything, he smoked weed and watched porn. I mean,
right.
You know, maybe we were just lucky, I think, in that movie. And I think a lot of the backlash that came with 5, I think, came from the fact that we got that character development in 4. And you're totally right. A lot of these movies have those kind of asshole characters that, you know, we're kind of set up to want to see die. I think, unfortunately, after getting a film like Final Chapter, where each kill in the movie you feel, you know, you really do. Even like I said, even the characters that are kind of assholes, you kind of feel bad when they die.
Well, I think it was said at the top of the show, too, this is a meaner movie.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And I think it works for the film. And, you know, I'm in no way just like trashing it because, like I said, I mean, I'm quite fond of this movie. But I do think it's interesting that the characters were written in ways that were just not even – the film's not even mean in the violent sense, but I think even in its portrayal of its protagonists. I mean, you know, there's such a violence to Tommy. And, you know, we understand why, because of all the stuff that he went through in 4. But I think just the film in general has that kind of tone.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think that it does kind of go back to what we were saying earlier about dealing, what we're not dealing with the day after. This movie also has a lot of aggression in it, and sort of what happens when people don't handle their aggression. And I'm sure there's probably like an academic essay to be written about sort of the lack of sympathy that is lost between 4 and 5 in terms of character presentation. Because I don't disagree with you. I think that there's just such a aggressive meanness to how this is presented, and we get characters who, by and large, just sort of represent the trope rather than make us connect with them first.
I mean, you get characters like Ethel, who is just like, there is not a shred of niceness in her whole body. She's just mean and miserable to everyone she meets. And you know that, like, you know the character of Ethel casually throws around the N-word in everyday conversation. Like, that's just who she is. Like, she's awful. She hates her kid. Her kid, I mean, Junior is very dim, but he's like feeding off of like all that hatred that his mother has. He's feeding off that, and he's throwing that back out into the world. And it's just like, it's ugly, but it's also the way it's portrayed is kind of hysterical at the same time.
Well, also, I mean, growing up, I hated the character of Junior with a passion. But, you know, my son, 2 of my children are on the spectrum. You know, they have autism, and my youngest, he has echolalia, so he'll repeat everything that he hears, every single thing. And now, like, revisiting that movie, I saw the character of Junior kind of do exactly the same, and you start to feel bad for Junior because the reason he is the way he is because of Ethel. there are those very cruel, no holds barred kind of, you could, you're right. She probably does say the N-word every day. She's probably homophobic. I don't see a single redeeming thing about Ethel. And I don't think that Junior, I don't think his reason for repeating is echolalia per se, but I feel that maybe that character gets a little too much shit from people and it's obviously not written to be this deep, but I also think Junior's most definitely a product of his environment. Well, the ending is something. I know I mentioned not being a huge fan of the ending, but I also think, they were trying to do something different, but at the same time, I think doubling down on the kind of idea that Tommy would continue it at the end of 4, I think when they have that kind of redemption moment in 5, when Tommy shows up to try to help save the day, and he's really bad at it. Tommy just gets screwed up nonstop when he shows up at the end. I think redeeming him and showing that he didn't become that person, I think that kind of shows that heart that I spoke of in Friday the 13th 5, and that ending, I think it kind of throws it in the trash in a lot of ways.
Well, I definitely think there are like studio shoehorned endings, right, where they definitely want you to be ready for the sequel that they invariably want to make, so you also, buy a ticket. And sometimes the unfortunate thing about that is no matter what heart and soul or pathos or like character development you do, there's always somebody who's looking at the bottom line of financial return. And with major movie franchises, as much as it pains any film fan to hear, that's always a factor. And so when I see stuff like this, it's a bummer to know that was put there solely to prepare you for a sequel, so you would like once again turn around and buy a ticket. I would like to at least believe that it's kind of an ending in the way that, say, the killer popping up at the very last before credits second at the end of I Know What You Did Last Summer is, because then, when we open on I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, that never happened. It was just like a jump scare to get us to the next movie.
I typically disregard the last minute of any horror movie as something that's actually happened.
That's smart.
Yeah, I just usually I just like disregard it, like didn't happen, figment of all of our imaginations. Like the ending of Sinister 2, I think I love the Sinister movies, and I enjoy Sinister 2 I think more than most, and that last minute to me is a cheat. Yeah, that's one that like really stands out.
I'll keep this to a minimum because I don't want to take up a lot of time with Sinister talk on a Friday the 13th episode, but you have no idea how happy you just made me. I got so much shit when I put Sinister 2 as my favorite movie of that year for I think my list for Fangoria when I wrote for them. And it makes me so happy to meet someone that really enjoyed Sinister 2. I remember at Fantastic Fest, I went up to Scott Cargill and I told him how much I like Sinister 2. And, we were both kind of buzzed at the time a few years ago. And he was just like, oh, you're the one guy. But yeah, that's great.
So one last thing I want to bring up, and there's some more we can definitely add more. I just want to talk about, for a movie that has got a reputation for being really skeezy and a little sleazy and skeezy, a bit scuzzy. What I really liked when I was reading Crystal Lake Memories was how Danny Steinman had nothing but nice things to say about every single person that he worked with on this movie, with one exception that we'll get to. But it feels like by and large, with a couple exceptions, I think Melanie Kinnaman stands out as someone who did not have a good experience making this movie as Pam. But everyone had mostly good things to say about working with Steinman as a director, except for Dick Wieand, who played Roy. It's kind of hysterical because Steinman, after saying all these really nice things, he goes all in on this guy. He's like, and I just want to quote the book here really quick, reading once again from Crystal Lake Memories, which is a must-have for any fan of the series. Dick Wieand, What a complete fucking asshole this guy was. He was hired to play Roy, the fake Jason, and in his mind, he became the star of the movie. He had nothing nice to say about anything. The script was a piece of shit. Everyone was out to get him. The Jason mask was crap. Transportation horrible. Food tasteless, and he was embarrassed to be in the film. Funny thing was, I met him again in 2009 in Dallas. All smiles, so complimentary. Get this. He told me he's been going to these Friday conventions since they began, and he's made quite a bit of money. He claims it's given his life purpose. The idiot had no lines and only 2 medium close-ups in the film. People do not give this low-life piece of shit a dime for an autograph.
Oh my God.
I love it.
It's been a couple years since I've read that book, but man, that's great. And also, I mean, I know we're probably not to spoil future episodes, but I'll make this small spoiler anyways. We are having the writer of Crystal Lake Memories on our Part 7 episode, so that's definitely going to be a lot of fun.
It will be.
You know, I can honestly, I'm honored to say that I had met Danny Steinman a handful of times, and one of the times that we interacted, we did this convention at Cinema Wasteland, and he did a live commentary track with Part 5.
Oh, wow.
And it was really cool to listen to him kind of go scene by scene and sort of comment on a lot of the things that we in Independent Ways arrived at during this conversation. But he also was just a general assessment of Danny Steinman. He was just a very soft-spoken guy. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would not claim to know how he was on the making of a movie, because like who you are at the height of the coke-fueled 1980s and who you are like in the mid-thousands could be a world of difference. As we know, we all grow, we all change. But he had nothing but grand and nice things to say about everybody. Mm-hmm. He was very, very pleased about the experience. I mean, of course, he talked a lot about how this movie had studio interference, and you know they cut a lot, cut great number of scenes down. And of course, like as I had alluded to earlier, like that was just sort of par for course on the Friday movies. We know, as I said, John Carl Buechler had an entire different version of Seven that was altered by the MPAA. But yeah, it was just really cool to know that Danny Steinman was very proud of this movie, though it was the black sheep of the franchise. And mm-hmm. you had mentioned that Melanie Kinnaman did not have a great time making this. And I've also had, great pleasure of getting to know her over the years as well. And what I do like about my limited interactions with Melanie is she will tell you it was not great. She'll be the first person to admit that it was a difficult film for her. But she had kind of that similar trajectory, I think, that someone like Betsy Palmer did, where when she realized how these movies affect people and how they how people embrace them. It's sort of like you were saying earlier about horror conventions bring people of all walks of life, and because they celebrate these and they connect to them. When she saw that, I think it has given her a new appreciation for it. And I love seeing on her Facebook feed, she'll post like, have a good weekend, campers, or when it's Friday the 13th, mm-hmm. she'll post fan art. And so it's cool to see people who, even though maybe at the time were uncertain of kind of the nature of the film they were making, understanding that when you're part of something like this, it becomes bigger than you, and you either get to embrace that or always fight against it. And how miserable must it be to always fight against it? Because what fun is that?
Well, yeah, a lot of people, unfortunately, actors, that did horror films early on in their career, they look down on it. But I also don't think that they have a lot of exposure that a lot of these horror people do have with conventions, getting to know fans. I mean, there's that very cliche, this movie saved my life, this movie did that. As a kid, these movies very much did do that. Like speaking on that abuse that I was talking about, like that was my only escape, to live vicariously through these movies, because I knew when I was going to get home, things were going to get dark. And I feel like when actors like that go to these conventions, and I think that's a reason why I try to champion conventions so much, is because it is a good way to talk to these people that were in these movies, and maybe they walk away, like you said, with a new appreciation, and they walk away knowing that these movies aren't just throwaway movies to a lot of people, that they're very important to the development. And a lot of people, especially children, I mean, a lot of them kind of live vicariously through these characters. I mean, how special is it to watch the original Halloween and see Laurie, someone who, was kind of the bookworm shy person, rise up and be able to survive. I mean, it's beautiful. Or like a film like Texas Chainsaw. These aren't throwaway movies. These aren't throwaway characters. And horror, I think, is the most important and also relevant genre around for those reasons.
I absolutely agree. I've always said that horror, when done well, can be the most powerful of genres for exactly the reason that you're saying, because you can utilize that otherness to speak to issues that maybe the world is not ready to address head on. The monster can be allegorical. The ideas can be bigger. It's funny, even when we talk about queer reads of movies, I frequently utilize Laurie Strode as an example of otherness, because when people talk about other in horror, they most frequently go to the idea of the monster being other, like the Frankenstein monster or the creature from the Black Lagoon, and how they're outsiders in society. But characters like Laurie Strode or Ginny Field, the idea that they are not the popular girls. And even if they've got a group of friends who are, and you can see Laurie just wanting to belong and wanting to connect to them, but it is Laurie ultimately who has to not only fight with herself, but like fight this allegorical boogeyman to become who she needs to be. And you're right, that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Whenever I think of horror and I think of like the sense of community and the sense of belonging, I often think of what Joss Whedon said when he was writing for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and he would say like all of the monsters in that show, they're allegories for the problems that everybody goes through. That you would have like, crushing depression, anxiety, trouble with parents, trouble at school, trouble fitting in, and your monsters are really nothing more than stand-ins for that. And I think horror, more than any other genre, allows you to externalize these problems. Like in about 1 month, will be graduating with my master's in counseling, and I'm really excited. And one of the modalities of mental health treatment I really like is this idea of narrative therapy, this idea that we often take our problems and we internalize them. We are a depressed person. We are anxious. We have, trauma, as opposed to taking that issue and then kind of externalizing it and making it something that is different from ourselves. It's not a part of us. We are not just that trauma. We are not just that depression or anxiety. I think horror allows you that ability to really kind of come together as a community and kind of tackle these things head on.
Well, also, and this is very short and off topic, but I agree with you 100%. So many times we kind of define ourselves with what our struggles are. Mm-hmm. I mean, even recently, and I don't know how into detail I want to go with this, but a few weeks ago, my wife and I lost a baby. And, that daughter that we were going to have was, that loss was so soul crushing that it just changed me for the worse for probably a couple weeks. And it was only after talked with a therapist about it that they tried to recommend putting a name or give it an identity to that, instead of just internalizing it. So what we did, we got home, we wrote down our daughter's name, we wrote down what we thought she would be into, what she would look like and all this stuff, and it's helped dramatically. And I think horror films, when done right, like Michael said, can be similar to that. The Babadook, films like this year's Starfish. Those films are so good because they take ideas of monsters and grief and trauma and PTSD and so many things and use them. They put a face to that trauma. I mean, The Babadook is very much about a mother and her child, not knowing how to cope with the loss of, the father, the husband. Or Starfish, that movie is about a woman really not knowing how to let go of loss. And I feel like horror is the perfect way to address that. And in small ways, it's like a real sleazy movie. But I think, like Michael said earlier, I think Friday the 13th 5 really did, maybe to a lesser degree, really like
shine a light on the aftermath of trauma and that kind of stuff. And I think that it makes the horror genre that much more powerful.
I agree. And I really appreciate you sharing that. I know that, Jerry, you in particular, you've been through a lot these past few weeks. And, I just think it's really brave how open you are about discussing it, where a lot of people would just kind of internalize that. And I think that if that really helps you, I think that's a really wonderful thing that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So I think that covers our discussion on Friday the 13th, Part 5. I think we definitely went in some areas that were unexpected.
Part 5?
Yes. Michael, if people want to see your work, I think we were talking off air, I've come to know your work through some of your earlier films you did with a filmmaker that's local to me here in New England, Richard Griffin, through The Sins of Dracula and Flesh for Inferno, these really fun, low budget kind of exploitation horror movies. But tell us overall, some of the projects that you have worked on and that you currently have in production right now.
Yeah, I'm very grateful and lucky that I've gotten to work on a number of different projects across a number of different genres and I guess price points. Not that, to me, money making a movie is irrelevant. It's the passion that you bring to it. And I started in the world of indie horror. The first feature that I worked on was a collaborative effort with New York filmmakers Alan Rowe Kelly and Bart Masternardi, and that was Tales of Poe, and it was an anthology of 3 modern-day tellings of Edgar Allan Poe stories. I wrote the third one, which was an adaptation of a poem of his called Dreams, and relevant to this podcast, the segment that I wrote featured Amy Steele and Adrienne King from the Friday the 13th franchise, as well as Caroline Williams from Texas Chainsaw 2 and some other people. So that was kind of a really cool outing, right out of the gate, because I grew up loving these movies and have these women who I adored in that film. And seeing the life that film has had has been very gratifying. As you mentioned, I worked with Richard Griffin, who I love. He's a New England-based filmmaker who just really has his own style and sensibilities that just I love his movies. He's made stuff like Disco Exorcist, and
I love the Disco Exorcist.
And None of That, and Atomic Brain Invasion. He has an affinity for that drive-in exploitation style that I think we so sorely lack in this world today. And I'm glad that he still does it. And I am so grateful we did 2 features that I wrote together, as well as a few shorts. The one of which that you mentioned, The Sins of Dracula, was sort of our homage to Christian scare films and the idea of what if Hammer had made one, and it's all about Dracula taking over community theater. And Flesh for the Inferno is a demon nun movie. I love and I'm so honored that I got to make those. I always am very thrilled that people have seen them, and when people bring them up, I love it. I do a lot of TV movies these days. I've written movies for Hallmark, Lifetime, Ion. I have written a handful of Christmas movies, like A Christmas Reunion starring Denise Richards and Patrick Muldoon. I have a new movie coming out this July, which is a killer stepmom movie called The Wrong Stepmother that was produced by Vivica Fox. She's in it, as well as Corin Nemec from Parker Lewis Can't Lose, for you 80s and 90s kids.
Yeah, that show was so good. The Coob.
Yeah. And I've got a killer babysitter movie coming out later this year. And then I myself, as a writer and director, have done a few projects. I wrote a short last year called He Drinks, which was kind of a queer relationship comedy that premiered at Outfest and did the festival circuit. And I have written and directed a new thriller that's coming out this year called The Office Is Mine, which is all about office territorialism. And what happens when you take that to a deadly degree. And I also just recently contributed a segment to Deathcember, which is an international holiday horror anthology where they asked 24 filmmakers from around the world to craft tales of holiday horror. And my segment is called All Sales Fatal, about a woman and the issues she has at a gift exchange counter. It stars horror fave Tiffany Shepis. and also features a cameo by creator of Final Destination, Jeffrey Reddick. So I'm very thrilled for that.
I'm so excited for that anthology. For our listeners, really quick, one of the segments stars the guest for our next episode for Jason Lives, AJ Bowen. So yeah, I'm really stoked for that one.
Oh yeah, I've seen the segment that AJ's in. It's called Milk and Cookies. It was directed by Sam Weinman. It's a lot of fun. I think that, luckily those of us who are LA based, we all kind of tried to help each other out on our segment. So we've all seen any of the LA-based filmmakers. I've seen what they've done. And if those 5 shorts are any indicator of what the overall film's going to be, I think people are really in for a wild ride.
This looks like a lot of fun, and it looks like, looking at the directors list for that movie, there's like Lucky McKee, Pollyanna McIntosh, and along with a number of up-and-coming directors like Amelie is listed in there as well. Like looks like there's a number of like really talented kind of like veterans.
Yeah, and Zach and
BJ are in there.
Yeah, BJ Colangelo. I'm really excited for theirs. I also I scored BJ's next short that's coming out pretty soon. So yeah, that whole anthology has so many good directors in it.
And let's talk about your podcast. People want to hear more of you, Michael, and hear more of you talk about horror. Let's talk about Dead for Filth right now, and what the premise of that is, and some of the guests you've had on for there.
Sure. Dead for Filth is a podcast I've been doing for almost 2 years now. It, as I say at the top of every show, it is the podcast for all things queer horror and beyond. It was born out of my interest in the fact that there seems to be a lot of crossover with the queer community and an interest in the horror genre. And for a long time, I had been writing about the topic, and I had contributed to different books and sites about it, and it led to me kind of having an annual gig hosting the San Diego Comic-Con International Queer Horror Panel. And over the time of hosting that panel, I would have a lot of different guests, including like Brian Fuller, who was the showrunner of Hannibal, or Jeffrey Reddick, creator of Final Destination, Gwen Turner, who wrote the screenplay for American Psycho, Mark Patton from Nightmare 2. And what was really great is we would really start touching into these social commentary discussions that felt very important, and then the time would run out. I had 1 hour a year with 6 or 7 amazing guests. And when I was meeting with the platform that ended up becoming the parent platform for Dead for Filth, it's a streaming service called Reverie, they had asked me originally to maybe do a scripted series, and for whatever reason, I can't remember what it was, we couldn't figure it out at the time, but they were launching a podcast network, and they said, well, do you have an idea for a podcast? And I had said, yeah, I would really like to continue sort of this work that I'm already doing, talking to these creators in the space and preserving their history, because I know what that would have meant to me as someone in the LGBTQ community who had no representation growing up, in terms of like feeling like there was someone I could look to and understand why I was drawn to this. And, so I wanted to go from the idea of having 7 amazing guests for an hour a year to having 1 great guest an hour a week. And that's where Dead for Filth came from. And I'm very lucky that the show has sort of taken off. Just recently, I'm proud to say The Advocate named it one of the 12 LGBTQ podcasts you should be listening to. Wow. I've had guests like Veronica Cartwright, who was in The Birds and Alien and Witches of Eastwick. I've had Darren Stein, writer and director of Jawbreaker. I'm trying to think. Jan Gonzalez, who recently directed Knife Plus Heart, which is a very big, recently discussed film. Ray Santiago from Ash vs. Evil Dead is the guest this week. It's just been really cool. Peaches Christ, So I always say I will have writers, directors, actors, drag queens, punk rockers, and anyone in between who is creating in the world of queer horror and their allies. And that's I'm very lucky to facilitate these conversations, and I'm just grateful for the guests who come on and share their stories.
So I'm always wary of asking of like what it means, like what does it mean for this community, because you're one member of the community, but could you speak to, like, as a queer male, what it means to see more representation in horror and in art right now? Like, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? Because like you said, like, we didn't necessarily have that, 10, 20, 30 years ago. What does it mean to you now to see greater representation in storytelling, particularly in genre storytelling?
Well, it's so important. I think I can never stress how important it is, because when you are in a world where it doesn't feel like anything is made for you, to even see a shred of yourself represented on screen, or a shred of the issues that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, or to a greater extent, seeing someone like you getting to tell your stories, that has impact. And I will even remove that from the horror genre and take it into the world of creating creativity in general. It's why, something like Patty Jenkins directing Wonder Woman had the cultural impact that it did, is the idea that for so many years, there were all of these male-driven superhero movies, and they were also men behind the camera. So here's a movie that's like about a woman, made by a woman, and what does that mean for little girls who have always wanted a superhero movie to call their own, or little girls who want to be filmmakers and make superhero movies of their own? And it means a lot when you don't see yourself represented to suddenly see yourself. And that's really kind of the work that I want to preserve and the history I want to preserve, because there are so many people who have waited for so long just to see their stories. And the sad fact is there are people who are still waiting. And it is both our jobs as creators and advocates for creators to always raise the voices of people whose work we appreciate, but also do our best to help raise the voices of people who are just trying to tell their story and get out of the way once they do. And I think that, I always tell, because I've mentioned USA Up All Night a couple times, but there was an airing in 1992 of a movie called Vegas in Space, which was a movie that Troma distributed. And I'm not going to say that it was the greatest movie, but Vegas in Space is a sci-fi adventure movie, and the cast is entirely San Francisco drag queens from the late 80s. Now, in the post-RuPaul era, where there are drag queens on TV and the cover of magazines and in commercials, it seems like this should not be impactful for the queer community. But in 1992, when I'm sitting at home, barely understanding what my life is, let alone understanding that there's this whole other world out there, the idea of drag queens on TV seems so unbelievably alien and punk rock, because I just never thought I would see that.
Right.
And so fast forward to now, where not only is there a weekly show where drag queens compete for attention and money, they've won Emmys for it. And if you talk to any of the people, like Peaches Christ is a drag queen in the world of horror who's also a very dear friend of mine. We've had the conversation where 10 years ago, when we were hanging out and she was doing shows and I was on the road with her, I would have never conceptualized that they would have a convention at the Los Angeles Convention Center, and moms and their daughters would come to meet their favorite drag queens, because we were always told, no one wants to see that. And it's the same thing. Drag is a radical extension of what we're talking about, but that's usually been the public's reaction to queer content in general. And for so long, we fought so hard just to see anything. The long way around answer to the question you asked is to see any representation, to see a movie like Knife Plus Heart come out of Cannes, and it's a queer giallo movie. That's amazing.
It's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Michael, and you're welcome to come back on any time. We really appreciate having you on here tonight. And thanks for giving your time. I did not expect to go 2 hours tonight.
Well, it was really my pleasure. Like I said, I love talking about these movies. I love talking about the social issues behind these movies, because I think it was Jerry who said earlier, these movies do have a heart, and they are important, and they're very healing. And I think to the world outside, sometimes it does just sort of look like the sleaze that we kind of joked about before. But for people who have felt like an outsider or who are dealing with trauma or dealing with loss, sometimes we have to invest into the fantastic to get the catharsis that we need, because these movies are cathartic. You know, they are horror movies, but it's the fear in the screen is something we can wrap our minds around and then walk away from. And for a moment, it makes us forget about the fear of our lives, which is an ongoing existential crisis. And that's not for nothing. I think that's so important. And so to spend 2 hours talking about a movie that I bet the world at large would not think has that kind of impact to some people, that's worth it to me.
Beautiful. Well, thank you again, Michael. Jerry, do you want to let everyone know what we have coming up next week?
Yes, I do. Well, that was like a boost of energy. Sorry. It's just this 100-degree weather. Next week we have Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, one of my favorite movies of all time. And we're talking about it with someone who lists it as his favorite movie of all time. Like, I don't think it's his favorite horror movie. I think it's his favorite movie. And that's A.J. Bowen from The Signal, You're Next. I Tracked the Devil from this year, which was so good. We're really excited about that. And we also have a contest. I think there's 4, maybe 5 days. Actually, by the time this airs, it'll probably be over. But, you know, maybe I'll extend it a week if it's not. Sure. I have a Jason Lives Laserdisc, really good quality. I'm not using it. So if you guys like the show, share the show, review it, retweet it, whatever. If we get to 500 followers on the Twitter page in the next week after the show's aired, I'll extend it. Then I'm going to send it to a random follower.
We got just over 300 followers to go for that. And for a show we've been out for about a month now, I can live with that. I think I say this every week and I really mean it. We have such an awesome community of listeners. Like, they mean just like the commentary we get on Twitter each day and the back and forth we get really means a lot. We just got another review today, like a nice review here on iTunes. And so please, I cannot encourage anyone who's listening enough. If you like what you hear, wherever you get your podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, wherever, if you can take 2 minutes and leave us a rating and a quick little review, that goes a long way to helping people find us. We interact with pretty much anyone who leaves us a comment on Twitter. We are at Pod and Pendulum, and I'm usually on there, going back and forth. Jerry also as well will go back and forth with anyone who makes any comment, good or bad. And we try to keep it very positive on there because, one of the things I like to do is like talk about other shows we're listening to at the moment too, because I just think that I think this world will be a much better place if instead of trying to trash things all the time, which there's a place for it, we discuss the things we love and kind of built up that community a little bit more. And that is my hippy-dippy bullshit for the night, but I really do believe that. So once again, everybody, thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week with Part 6, and we got some other special things we are planning for the future as well. So till next week, have a great one.
Okay, I told you this isn't funny. Now you're gonna get it, bitch.